Greetings, welcome to Terra Prime Live. Darth Nano is coming to you from Terra Prime headquarters. So we are back on with the forms. We are now on Form 2, Makashi, the Contention Form, the Dueling Form, the Count Dooku form. So we have assembled a panel of experts in this particular genre with us today. So let's get to go to meet him. Our first guest of honor is Cang Snow from Lightspeed Saber League. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
All right. And we've also got our contact over there from France, Olivier. He's going to be joining us tonight. So we're going to be doing a semi-bilingual thing here or there. So helping us out with that portion of it, we have our friend Daniel Maratz. Hello. And of course, Ben Judkins and Deso from Gulf Coast. Jeez, whew. It's been a long pandemic. So like I said, we are starting again here with the forms of Form 2, Makashi, the Contention Form. In canon, they talk about it being very dueling centric, very like that. Of course, fandom has taken that to mean fencing, almost to the exclusion of everything else. We'll talk a little bit about that, but there's some rules and stuff like that go along with the one-on-one duel, which kind of span pretty much anything and almost every weapon. So we'll kind of go into that. But then we'll kind of talk about how Shicho we talked about being very military oriented and simple to learn, easy to encapsulate, right? And you can get people relatively competent with it relatively quickly. And that's the kind of goal for that kind of training. Some of the physical aspects of it being more toward a military kind of aspect, group fighting, formation, that kind of thing. Now, as we transfer over into here, of course, with us in our system, we try to stay a little, as close as we can to what we have of the canon stuff, but we know there's lots of variations of that. So we're looking at basically focusing on the one-on-one dynamic, right? So there's a couple of things that we don't have to worry about in this particular situation. And these things kind of allow the styles or approaches to this to flourish, and the different approaches to these problems, of course, being the stylistic differences and the different approaches. So one thing, and we can start discussing things like this, is Makashi in the video games and the novels and stuff like that, and as it is stated on Wikipedia and through Craig's paper, all of that kind of thing, really kind of focuses on something that emerged out of a dueling culture. And that that kind of like brings with it certain things. Now, for us, three of us here are from a Chinese background, and the Chinese dueling culture doesn't really have a whole lot of weight to it, except for very, very long time ago, thousands of years ago. Like between 2000 and 1500 years ago, there seems to be a robust dueling culture, but after that, there doesn't seem to be. If there was, there doesn't seem to be a lot of record of it. that being said, you can look at the weapons from that era and you can compare them to similar weapons from other, areas that had the same type of culture, and you can see, pretty distinct similarities. For instance, like we've got these Han dynasty, which is that type of dueling weapon in China. They have a very long handle, very long blade. They're very thrust centric. All this, very much like rapiers and stuff like that in Europe, right? So as we're approaching, Makashi, we're really thinking about how we're interacting with another person, right? And obviously that's going to bring in those kind of universal things like obviously reach, distancing, that kind of thing is going to be something that's very particular within a one-on-one context that is going to be different in other contexts, right? So why don't we throw that out? Who does anybody want to chime in on stuff of those types of qualities that we see?
I'd like to start with a question, just a really basic question, as long as we have Cang here.
Yes.
So Cang, with the Lightspeed group, how do you guys view the forms themselves, and has Makashi and the notion of dueling kind of informed what you guys are doing?
So Lightspeed Saber League's pretty decentralized. So each individual team kind of handles that on their own perspective. But from the upper level perspective, meaning the official position of the league, as far as the forms are concerned, is that the league style is largely formless. If it has any form at all, then I think, and I don't know my form super well, but I think that Niman might be the closest thing, which, if I understand correctly, is supposed to be sort of the very practical form that kind of combines aspects of all the others. And please correct me if I'm wrong. But the idea is simply that, we're focused on doing what works. But forms are a very useful way to communicate, though, because she chose a very self-consistent style and system within itself, in my opinion, and Makashi is also very self-contained within itself. And so these are good ways to put people in different mindsets. So for me personally, forms are very good instructionally, but as far as any kind of formal system or official recognition within Lightspeed Saber League, there is none.
Yeah, and that's very similar to our approach to it as well. The forms are training capsules or training compartments, right? So you're building up on skill. It's progressive in nature, and we always said that whenever you go into any type of a duel or anything like that, you should be bringing all of your skills with you, right? You're not going to let some aside because, well, this isn't this form or whatever.
Yeah, I fully agree with that.
Yeah, so that's very, very, very similar. And again, that's where I was kind of getting with the one-on-one dynamic, right? Because we can argue over Makashi, right? Well, you say you don't know them very well. Honestly, there really isn't that much. There isn't much there, So we're all pretty. We've got carte blanche, so we can kind of really go in there.
I like the idea of starting with, a dueling culture, because, you and I were going back and forth earlier this week when we were looking at Chinese history, right? Mm-hmm. We were looking at 19th century Chinese history, and people were talking about dueling culture in 19th century China, and we were trying to figure out what the heck does that mean, right? Because what dueling culture means in a Western European background is not ever exactly what is going on in China. And so, what what is the parameter when we say that this is swordsmanship that is meant for dueling, but it's happening in a, you know, in a foreign, in a fantasy context, right? What are the essential elements that we're supposed to be drawing out of this?
Right.
You know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like my most common example, right, is as you're training for this type of encounter, is that the one thing you don't have to worry about is you know where the opponent is, right? And you know where they're trying to get to, right? That's clear. Now, whether you're doing it and you know, this is something that we should explore too, is that, you know, dueling and sport really overlap a lot, right? Because dueling can be as very, very, very ritualized, you know, to the point of being almost abstract, you know, and then it can be just utterly brutal and, you know, two guys in a pit, one guy leaves, right? Um, but as far as like a dueling culture with these weapons, you know, there's obviously other kinds of those dynamics that I think are there.
Yeah, I would ask Cang about, sorry, I don't know your group very well. I just know that it's there. So I'm curious, like, what's your rule set? Who shows up? So when we have these duels and you talk about form practice, like, what are you referring to? And yeah, how do you, you know, how long are rounds? What are the techniques used? I'd be really curious to know.
Oh, well, thanks for the question. So I guess to briefly summarize, so we've sort of have a 3-point system. So every score can be worth from 1 to 3 points, and it's an asymmetric scoring system. So it's each point value is based on different things that you're doing, which are based on kind of a skill shot, essentially. Um, so a first touch is 1 point. If it's a clean touch, then it's 2 points. If it's a headshot, then it's 2 points also. And then if it's a defensive shot, then meaning you block and counterattack, or you attack and then block the follow-up, that's 3 points. So it's basically awarding you based on the difficulty of what you've just done, essentially. So that's the basics of the scoring system, and otherwise it's full target essentially, except the groin. That's the basics. I think you asked me who shows up, but I'm not quite sure what you meant by that.
I guess, are they, you know, people who would be playing some other kind of martial art and are interested in doing lightsabers because it's safe and fun, or is it people who would never do martial art but are Star Wars fans and so come out for this? Who are you training?
I would say that it's a little bit of a both. There's we have a lot of overlap with fencing, with traditional fencing, and we also have a lot of overlap with Eskrima. However, I would say that our system is pretty unfamiliar for most people, especially traditional martial arts. So we probably get a lot more non-martial artists than actual martial artists. I personally like training people who come in with no preconceived notions. And so I think that's an area in which I excel at, or at least that's an area that I think I do pretty well. So I think we tend to attract that type of person more. So that's part of our ethos too. We're very non-traditional, and it's probably just comes from my own background. I'm not. I did some martial arts as a child, but it's not something I spent a lot of time with. So.
Have a follow-up question for you and for everybody, but like, given that when we play lightsaber sword play, like, why isn't it all Makashi? If Makashi's the dueling one, and usually all my friends set up in one-to-one encounters. I haven't seen Battle of the Nations with lightsabers yet, so I'd be very curious. Like, what are the other ones for? I'm being a bit devil's advocate to get people talking, but if in the lore Makashi's the dueling set, everything we're doing is dueling. No.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at, was there are universal dynamics within a dueling, whether you're doing it as Screama, whether you're doing a kendo, whether you're fencing, whether you're, all of this kind of stuff. There are these things. Again, the first obvious one is there's one person there, right? And they are limited into how they can approach you depending on where you are, right? And the different ways that we approach those and solve those problems is what then gives us, quote, style or anything like that. It's not that there's any difference. So, right. I mean, and that's what we would cover in that first one, is that the forms themselves, they don't, in reality, fighting doesn't work like that, right? You don't change styles like in a video game, right?
Or the Matrix.
You bring everything you have, right? And if I know this, I'm not thinking style when I'm going for openings. I'm responding to attacks and that kind of thing.
But dueling is interesting in that it allows for style because it imposes social rules onto violence, right? It begins to hem in what can happen, right?
Right.
So, I mean, I have a wonderful lightsaber adjacent story, right? In Ithaca Sabers, maybe Rob is listening. I have a student named Rob who was a combatives instructor in the U.S. Army for a lot of years. And before our lightsaber class, there's a BJJ group that meets. And the BJJ group was forever disgusted that, someone who is as tough and martial as Rob was spending his time messing around with swords. And they really wanted him to, take up the, Brazilian jiu-jitsu study. And Rob was never into it. And so at one point they started asking him, so what were you guys teaching in the Army? What, if someone did this, what would you do? Of course, the classic martial arts, discussion. And Rob was like, look, what you guys do is a sport. What I taught people in the Army is if someone had a gun and, they did that, the three other people that were around him would surround him and pile on top of him, and then we would kill him, right? It was not a matter of technique, or all of the techniques were really about managing squads of people. And I was listening to this and I was like, this is fascinating, right? Because it's reliably like a martial art that assumes that there's more than one opponent and you don't know how they're armed, and you move in terms of 3 to 5 people at a time, right? Nobody, right? And that I think is really interesting because it begins to get at this question, in terms of military combatives versus BJJ, right? One is a competitive sport. And because you know what the rules of it are and you know what the engagement is, you have been able to develop notions of style. And then all of the sociality and the social things that go along with that surround it, right? Whereas the other one is, what would you do? Well, I would get those 3 other privates and we would surround the guy. I mean, it's like, we're not fooling around here. It's like we're clearing a room. It's a different sort of an exercise, right? And you can kind of do that with swords too. With Sicho, there's no assumption in Sicho that there's one opponent and that opponent has a sword. As a matter of fact, if you look at our form for Sicho, I think the assumption is a lot of times they have a pole arm, right? And, we don't really spar with groups of people, but,
Not yet, but we're trying to get something together.
But in Ithaca Sabers, we would play games. We would play sparring games with groups of people so that you would develop those other aspects of Sicho. And you know what? That all goes away as soon as you get to Makashi. There really is a notable change in the assumptions about what's going on here. And that for me, Sicho reads a lot like a martial art. And Makashi really begins to blend into that realm of sport, almost imperceptibly at first.
Absolutely. I mean, but it really comes down to that because when you're talking about duels, there, like you said, there are rules that are set down, right? So that the rules, I mean, and we're seeing that kind of happen in real time with lightsaber, right? So we've got the ASL FFE rules in France, right? We're working on getting them over here. We have the Lightspeed rules. You've got Saber Legion rules. You've got all of these things. All of these are approaches. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Gang. I don't know if you do group battles yet, but most of these are all based on one-on-one, you know, type of encounters and, you know, and that sport. I wanted to bring Olivier into this. You are a saber. Your event is saber primarily. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, I am. Please repeat.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't understand the question.
Yes.
Sorry.
Ton événement sportif dans l'escrime, c'est le sabre, s'il comprend bien?
No, épée.
Oh, épée.
So
okay.
he's an épée fencer, like Cang. Cang aussi.
Okay, very good.
Yes, c'est le plus près de la pratique du sabre laser.
Yeah.
He finds that épée is closest to lightsaber fencing. Yeah.
Right.
Good choice, Olivier.
So maybe explain it a little bit. You can do it en français, but
expliquer l'épée,
like,
le but de l'épée.
How they compare, like sabre laser, épée.
Comment se compare-t-il l'épée laser et l'épée comme tel?
L'avantage, je te le fais en français du coup.
Ok, fais-le en français, je vais traduire. Pas trop lent, hein.
Ouais, l'avantage de la similitude entre l'épée et le sabre laser, c'est déjà au niveau des cibles, puisque à l'épée on peut toucher le corps entier, et du coup au sabre laser aussi. Après, voilà, je vais déjà te laisser traduire cette partie-là.
So the similarity that he finds very advantageous is with épée and lightsaber, you have the whole body as the target.
Yeah.
Après, du coup, ça se mélange aussi avec le sabre et le fleuret dans les règles du jeu, c'est-à-dire qu'au sabre, à l'épée, c'est le premier qui touche qui va marquer le point. Si on se touche en même temps, il y a un point chacun. Au sabre et au fleuret, l'avantage, c'est qu'il y a un système comme au sabre laser et dans les règles de la SLFFE, des systèmes d'attaque et de parade et de riposte et de contre-riposte et de phrases d'armes.
So the second advantage is I guess the right of way and the striking structures in the rule set somewhat resemble each other, so you don't have to relearn a rule set as you play. Je crois que j'ai bien traduit. Je suis pas certain. Fleuret, c'est le plus peu. Foil. Ok, oui, parfait.
Oui. Au fleuret, on peut toucher uniquement le tronc.
Oui.
Et au sabre, tout ce qui est au-dessus de la ceinture.
Okay. So he's commenting on the target differences with foil and saber, and of course the épée allows you to use the whole body.
Right. Ça fait un mélange des trois armes. Et après, la dernière similitude qui est très ressemblante, c'est en termes de distance. C'est-à-dire que sur le Makashi, notamment, on retrouve la même distance qu'en combat à l'épée sur des compétitions entre deux tireurs. À part le fait que nous soyons condamnés dans un couloir, nous. Voilà.
So the final point, I think the most interesting one for this conversation, if I edit it, is that Makashi, he feels really, and épée resemble each other in terms of distancing. Ideal distances taken, and he said in fencing, of course, you're constrained to the corridor, but he feels that there's a similar approach to distancing.
Yeah.
Peux-tu développer ça un tout petit peu plus par rapport à la distance, les cibles, le bras, le corps, etc.?
Ouais, je vais essayer. Alors en termes de distance, enfin, je vais passer sur autre chose, mais sur les déplacements, hein, les changements de vitesse qu'on peut retrouver sur le bon fente, sur la passe avant, le pas croisé avant qu'on appelle en Makashi, que nous on appelle la passe avant et qui permet par l'équivalent de ce mouvement de pouvoir se déplacer, de faire 2 marches d'un seul coup, donc de cacher son arrivée et de pouvoir accélérer sa fente. Alors on le voit plus dans le Dulon Nero, qui est quand même plus orienté escrime que le Dulon de Maître Anonymous, où il faut quand même avoir des notions un peu plus de kung-fu maintenant, je pense. C'est pour ça que cette forme, elle est bien, parce qu'au début, on est plutôt branché sur l'escrime et puis on dévie plus ou moins après sur une pratique kung-fu.
Okay, stop. That was a lot. I just saw these blank faces.
Résumer l'esprit.
Fascinating. I understand him. Bien sur les autres. Sorry, now I'm also forgetting what language I'm speaking. Very interesting comment on the progression through form training that might resemble Western fencing a bit more, and the TPLA Makashi, which allows the use of things like forward cross steps and forward cross steps that resolve into lunges, and all of these things that are a little bit more kung fu, but that Olivier is appreciating because the amount of distance you can cover and the kind of transformation that happens to your movement as you go from thinking really just in terms of back and forth on a line into arcing and crossing steps. J'espère, Olivier, que je ne magane pas.
Je crois.
No, I understand. I think, and I do agree.
Les changements de rythme. Rhythm changes of Makashi.
And when I was in Paris, that was the #1 problem that all of the Masters of Arms had, was fighting in switch stance, right? Having their non-dominant foot forward. It was, yeah. I mean,
I began fencing when I was 6.
Yeah.
it's ancré.
Yes. So, but that's a good example. That's a really good example of what I'm kind of talking about, where you have dueling, the one-on-one game where we talk about constraining this stuff, and you start to have these rules and stuff, like you can start to dictate style almost, if you want people to behave in a particular way, you can have ways. One of those ways is limiting targets, right? All that stuff. And you can do this for a bunch of different reasons. We do it for pedagogical reasons in TPLA most of the time, which is just like we have like the head hunt, which is the only valid target is the head. And that's just to get people to get used to protecting their head. It's an artificially, constrained game or whatever to build up a skill. But yeah, there's a lot of that in there, and everything from like sumo wrestling to whatever. You have very, very ritualized forms of this kind of stuff, but you also have a lot of, and I think with lightsaber it's really interesting because you have a lot of also freedom, because our weapons can change. Like we can be holding a rapier and then instantly a katana. We don't have to change what we're doing, right? So we can go one-handed, we can go two-handed, we can reach, we can do a lot of different stuff. That's not always necessarily an advantage. Sometimes it's not good to have too many tools, but anyway.
I would also have a follow-up question for Cang and also for Olivier, because the Makashi that TPLA has adopted is a version of a Chinese martial arts form. And my experience with that particular training style is you get a lot of practice doing hand and wrist cuts. It's very, very wristy. And I'm really curious about your guys' experience as épée players, where the whole body is the target. And here we have this particular, like the distancing in the Kung Fu system. Of course, you can come in with liao, like these big chops to the body, but there's so much fiddly stuff that you spend time working with these kind of spiraling, jiao, stirring actions that work on the arms. So I'm curious about that. Like when you guys think of dueling, like when I think of dueling, because of having done Wudang Jian, I think, oh, I'm dueling is I'm going after my friend's arm. And maybe I'll hit him in the neck if I can get over the arm. But I really only think of having two targets and, whatever you can get, but truly here and then here. And I'm really curious about what you guys are up to.
To be fair, I am not a proponent of the wrist cut. I learned all of my cuts to different parts of the body. I've just so we're clear, take it away.
Olivia, do you want to take that first?
What?
Olivia, would you like to go first?
No, thanks. I don't understand the discussion.
Okay. Yeah. What is our perspective on wrist targeting as far as our background is?
I guess when I think of dueling, I think of maintaining a certain distance rather than getting into kind of infighting with the sword. Mm-hmm. And that when infighting with the sword happens and half swording and all those things, that's kind of like oh God, I got here, I'd rather not. And I'm curious if you have another rule, like people who are working with a different rule set and a different martial background, what's your experience of dueling? Like, do you think, yeah, I don't mind being really close to people. That's great. I mean, if you've got Filipino martial artists in there, just their weapons are shorter. They're much more comfortable in close.
Yeah, so the thing about, there's a big difference here in epee versus saber, whether we're talking about lightsaber or we're talking about Olympic saber. Because in epee, you can only score right at the point, right, Olivier? Yes. Right on the point.
Yes.
Okay. And so epeists really kind of work at two different distances. And Olivier, you tell me if you agree. But I would say that if you're gonna target anywhere you can here first, okay?
The hand.
Yes. And then if you can't get there, you're actually gonna get in closer, especially because I'm very short. I'm only 5'3". Okay, I am. I don't know how to convert that right now off the top of my head, but I'm only 5'3" tall. And so in epee, you want to be taller, right, Olivier? You want to be tall, right? In epee, and so I'm quite short for epee actually, and so one of the best things that I can do is to try to get in close as much as possible, because that's where I have the advantage. Okay, and so because if you think of epee as a spear, right? The only point that scores is the spear point, So if you can get past the spear point, you're good. Okay. So for someone like myself, I want to get in closer. That's the only way that I can defeat a taller opponent. So I would say that, yeah, it really, really depends on the weapon. And epee is a lot like a spear. And so it makes sense to, at first engagement, you're going to be far away going for this target here. But once you get past this target, you're going to go in deeper, So it really varies. Based on the person, and it varies based on the weapon. This would not happen, I don't believe at all, with a lightsaber. It doesn't make any sense with a lightsaber, in my opinion, because the moment you touch, you could be dead. So it wouldn't help. So that's my perspective as an epeist.
So what's your distancing like when you guys are playing with lightsabers? Because I assume the epee background has been firmly drilled into you. How do you change when you play with lightsabers?
I mean, in my opinion, if we're truly fighting with plasma swords, okay, then in a realistic situation, then it would be very much like epee, just like Olivier had said. A realistic lightsaber combat would be very much like epee. It would even be more strict than epee. It would be harder and harsher than epee, in my opinion. So at least in our system in Lightspeed, where this is a target, yeah, you have to protect your hands. You have to be good at protecting your hands. You don't start targeting in terms of tactics in our system anyway. You don't go for the body until you know that you're facing an opponent who is good at protecting their hands. If you go for their hands, if they can't protect their hands, If they know how to protect their hands, then you go for the body. That's the basic tactics.
Yeah, I don't think it's much different than rules for like first blood duels, right? Because in first blood duels, you don't need to get lethal hits. You can
Yes.
just scratch their hand. So that's your first target. You kind of move in, that way. And we see that again. That's one of those things that you see a lot in times in dueling culture. In Chinese, we're just now learning about the gorong, the hook shield, which allows us to get those thrusts in, because Chinese swords don't have much guard, right? In there while getting the other person's weapon off the line.
I don't want to go down a
Yeah.
rabbit hole, but did you make a Goron? Like, you have
Not
one?
yet.
Okay.
I'm going to. But the one thing I will say about plasma swords, if these were real plasma swords, obviously they would be completely abandoned probably a month into their invention, after everybody who tested them was dead. Because there's no way that that human beings are going to be waving these things around. I mean,
Space wizards. You need
yes,
space wizards. First, you get the
well,
space
there's got to be.
wizards,
There's
then
obviously
you
these. They're magic. They're glowing magic swords. That's what they are.
Well, the Jedi ain't no schlubs, So
What?
the Jedi ain't no schlubs,
And
Hey, man,
and they have really good microsurgery.
It's not an
right?
either or thing. It's always a gradation. You're always getting better. So there's always a point when what. You're gonna kill everybody around you. You're what? Oh no! Like the big battle in the what video game is it between the Sith and the Jedi? The realistic way of that is just all the lightsabers go here, boom, and then just a pile of dead people.
And I
Not
think
to
that's
mention
why
that
it was,
if you had an actual plasma blade that long, you'd probably incinerate yourself before anything happened.
it'd be a lot of heat produced on that. But I think that's why it's more, it was designed to be, it is a sword that is sheathed. It is a plane of force, less a plasma blade. And it became more the plasma concept later on. If you watch the duel between Luke and Vader, he taps Vader on the flight suit and it bounces off because there wasn't a lot of force behind it. It's not going to just burn through. And there's that concept too. Now, when it comes to like the differences between Shicho and Makashi, a lot of Shicho, even from a TPLA perspective, is a lot of wide cuts, a lot of wide slashes, and a lot of Makashi is that thrust point or the quick tap or even coming over the guard and around at this angle here versus coming through and trying to chop through your opponent. I think that's the big difference when looking at it from a military perspective into a dueling perspective, going from Shicho to Makashi.
Yeah, I think for me also, not a lot of time is you're playing with the blade, with the opponent's blade more than you would be in a kind of a military context, right? You can do deflections, you can do all kinds of things. You can attack with first, second, third intention. You can do, you just have a whole bunch of kind of different.
There's a lot more control, like you said, in the Makashi, where they're coming in, and one of the exercises in Makashi for TPLA is contentious opportunity, where you're backing away, gauging that distance to come back in and strike. Also, on the subject of wrist cuts for the ASL FFE, that's almost like a primary target for a lot of us to hit that first and then come in for a secondary strike toward the head or the body to get a better point scoring.
Right.
So that's still open for that.
Yeah.
So Deso, it occurs to me that you're in an interesting position here, right? So, you're an apprentice, you're working your way through the system. You are the one person, from the TPLA side here who has encountered Makashi the most recently. How did that change how did learning Makashi and practicing Makashi and getting signed off Makashi, how did that change your understanding of fencing? What did you personally take away from Makashi?
You're right. I am in a unique place. I do fighting on the side, not just Makashi, but also, or not just TPLA, but also some other stuff on the side. But I take everything I learn from TPLA and apply it to, like you say, you're fighting with everything you have. And I really think that taking that into even a battlefield situation, allowing you to get those angles, there's something to be said here when we're training. We say it's a game of inches and angles, because the whole point of the dueling here is to touch them. And if you're touching them just enough, with just enough reach, that's a lot of Makashi, that extra bit of reach that you don't get when you're using two hands in a very Shicho style. Also, quicker recovery. So if you swing, you're gauging that control and able to pull back before they're able to hit your hand. And second intention, they're coming for your hand, but you're already moved and coming around for another strike. There's a lot to be said about the different guards, just the exercises to get through your guards and your orbits into a new strike or a new movement.
Thank you.
Yeah. Was there a follow-up to that?
Well, no, I mean, it was a genuine question. I was curious what you had taken away, right? So it's like, no, that's, you know, that sounds, yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, those are a lot of the, you know, a lot of the concepts that, you know, kind of the way we present the material in a serialized fashion. Obviously, that's a lot of the stuff that's there. You know, it's always been interesting to me that people view Makashi as an inherently aggressive style. But when you get right down to it, a lot of what Makashi is about, you know, learning what the center line is so you can learn to keep your blade on it so you can keep yourself from getting stabbed, right? Actually, there's a huge amount of defensive geometry that is built into Makashi that you probably didn't think very much about when we first handed you a sword and you learned the basic cuts in Shicho, right? Where you're always cutting through those lines, you know, and now suddenly you're learning to stick to those lines. You're learning to cover those lines in a new way. You know, you're learning how range works with those lines, you know. So there's a really steep learning curve that I think goes on here, right? You know, your basics are in Shicho, but there's a lot of other parts of the discussion that come into Makashi.
Absolutely. Simple footwork. Shicho is a very forward, always forward form for TPLA. And Makashi is, okay, there is forward, but we're going to come back. We're going to come around the side. We're going to come around this side. And we're going to come forward, but the blade instead is going to come around from the side. There is a lot involved in it that you don't really notice on first watching.
One of the things about it is, I'm very influenced by a Western guy, Aldo Nadi. But talking about that line and being able to diverge from the opponent's line and stuff like that, but it's always there, right? You've always got that straight line there, and that's what I was, you know, earlier talking about. When you have one person, you can always draw that line, right? And then that makes that distance. Hence, in fencing, in the, you know, in Olympic sport fencing and stuff like that, things are done on that strip to, you know, keep things. If you've seen the HEMA, things get a little crazy, but but anyway, yes. So, yeah. So like the epee, I mean, obviously, if you're looking to get into, you know, fencing, or in college or something like that, and you're into lightsaber, it would appear that the expert advice is to take up epee. Obviously. Yeah, we've mentioned that before, Jared.
Rules,
Excuse me?
it depends a bit on your rules and your system, though. I mean, in my opinion, in most reflections of lightsaber currently, Ollie Saber is going to be closer than epee, because you don't need that point control. Plus, a lot of systems at this point have abandoned the thrust, including ours, for safety purposes, I believe. So
Yeah.
at this point, like I said, I try to differentiate this, but, you know, realistic lightsaber would probably be very epee-like, but the sport form that I think most organizations are coming to is diverging away from that, except for certain aspects like the targeting and things like that.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Oh, absolutely.
In the chat, Olivier has pointed out to my comment about going after hands. He said in EP, apparently 75% of the scoring in the World Championships was done on by hits to the body, and so the hand strikes are very much bridging towards the body rather than a particular end in themselves.
And that is something
thanks for sharing that, Olivier. Thank you.
Yeah, and that is also something that is kind of inherent in the ASL FFE based rules, or the ones that Cedric came up with, is that with the salvo, when you hit that, you could hit that easy target of the 1 point hand, and then try to get a higher target right after it. So it encourages that kind of thing, which
and you do see that in the Wudang Taolu too.
That's true.
There are a lot of there's a lot of quick cut parry and then a step and another cut, and you think about what's going on there. It's a hand cut or an attempted hand cut, a parry, and then a deep cut that comes next.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of in the Chinese systems. There's a lot of entering and exiting, right? It's wounding, coming in, and popping back out, right? And constantly trying to keep that, that distance. So like if you come into you're always seeing this hand shape and stuff. It's just so you don't forget it's there. And I guess this is probably more in Dao, but there is some grappling, right, where you can come in and get in there. But like I said, that's more Dao, which is a shorter kind of cutting weapon. So, but we have had fun. We do go in close with the lightsabers. It is it's tricky keeping those blades from touching you, right? But it adds a little bit of extra danger. It's kind of like with fighting in white tuxedos with painted sticks.
White tuxedos.
Yes.
If I could answer a question that I heard earlier, but we didn't actually address, I don't think.
Yes.
I can't remember if Daniel brought this up or if it was Ben, but I think one of you asked if Makashi is the dueling form, and most of us are one-on-one dueling, why aren't we seeing more Makashi? Why isn't that the default, right? I think Daniel, you asked that, right? Yeah, and I wrote that down because I thought thought that was a really good question, and I'm not sure that we really covered that. But if I may share my thought on that, and then
Sure.
and I'd like to hear from Deso and Olivier on this as well. In my opinion, you're probably not seeing it because dueling, especially life or death dueling, is not something that comes natural to people. Most people walk left, right, and most people, when they are given a sword or lightsaber, they're gonna two-fist it like this, and so I would say that Shicho probably comes a lot more naturally to people, when you learn Makashi and dueling forms, when you take an epee class, you learn to stand and you learn to move first. Those are the first things you learn. You don't learn slashing and stabbing first. You learn how to move first. And so I think that's why you don't see it naturally until people get taught how to do that.
That's actually a really good follow-up on that. And for us, it's, Shicho teaches you the basics, your footwork, and then you always return to the basics. Makashi for us teaches you some of the extra, the sidestepping, lateral work and stuff like that. But as far as like what's going on in the world and people dueling out there and why we don't see everybody using Makashi, honestly, it's because not everybody's out there training. Everybody's grabbing a lightsaber and swinging it. And, as the passionate ones, we'll put it that way, as the passionate ones learn more about what their passion is and they want to get better and they start training, they will start with the basics. They have to, and then grow from there. If you try to pick it up from non-basics like a Makashi setup, you're going to be hindering yourself without that foundation. And that's something, thank you, Ben, that I did find out the hard way coming up through it. So,
yeah, I think you're right about that.
Hey, I'm going to do a little summary for Olivier, okay? So he can
Yeah.
also tell us.
And our French viewers.
Donc Olivier, j'avais demandé il y a quelques minutes pourquoi c'est pas tout Makashi, parce que jouer avec les sabres laser ensemble, c'est un petit peu comme un duel quand même. Alors pourquoi on parle même d'autres styles? Alors Cang, pour répondre, a dit mais tu sais, il faut vraiment apprendre à se déplacer et à utiliser une seule main. C'est quelque chose qui demande de l'effort. Ce n'est pas une marche à deux mains avec des gros mouvements. Et par la suite, c'est ça, Deso a confirmé un petit peu ça, que c'est même en apprenant tout le curriculum, il a vécu ça aussi. Alors, si tu as des choses à rajouter, là, je vais traduire. Et ça, c'est un résumé.
L'avantage d'avoir fait un sport comme l'escrime, mais ça peut être d'autres sports, c'est qu'on a l'habitude d'avoir un opposant, un adversaire face à nous. La gestion du combat, entre guillemets, à son grand sens du terme, elle a été beaucoup plus simple pour moi sur le Makashi. Et c'est vrai qu'avec mes étudiants que j'ai à l'Académie de sabre laser de mon club, ceux qui n'ont jamais pratiqué un sport de combat avant sont super embêtés à partir du moment où ils commencent à faire le sundog. Pour eux, c'est difficile. Alors, il faut jouer sur l'imagination, d'avoir des adversaires en face, mais c'est vrai que c'est pas, cette approche-là, elle est déjà pas simple au départ. Après, moi, je leur apporte du coup petit à petit les éléments techniques qui vont permettre de déclencher des choses. Mais comme disait Deso, par petites touches, petit à petit, on construit le bloc, quoi. Je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu à la question.
I think so. To summarize, he was saying that his experience as an épée fencer set him up very well to be comfortable in every lightsaber situation. He was already used to having someone in front of him. And in his own club, when students come in and they don't have a sense of adjusting to another person and have to do all these coordination drills by themselves, figuring out how to facilitate that is a big part of his work, to convince people that it's worth doing and to appeal to their imaginations in training so that they're doing stuff that's a bit more formal with the idea that there's eventually going to be someone in front of them. Je crois que vraiment tu as répondu complètement et en fait en disant pas mal la même chose mais avec l'expérience de prof. So I'm saying he really responded to the question and kind of confirmed what the other candidates said, but with teachers' experience as well.
Another way to think of it too is that it's like in our system, we've set this up progressively because really when you start to see these types of qualities that they talk about in the forms, right? The dueling thing, whatever, right? And like we're kind of like beating around the bush and it's coming down. A lot of times it's just level of development of that particular person, right? As somebody develops more and they get more comfortable with what's going on, like you said, as they get taught these things that are completely counterintuitive, right? You cannot pick them up by yourself. You have to be in the situation to really understand it. It's a tactile thing. It's a thing. As they get more and more of that, you know, almost even undirected, if you set up their training well, I've had this experience a lot of times, they will start to figure these little clues out sort of on their own, so that when you finally introduce them to them, it's just like, oh, okay, that's what this is, right? And they can kind of add things to it. So, you know, if you're going to go with we can see people fighting with forms aspect of it, why do we see most people using sheet shows? Because that's probably the generalized level, as we were saying. When most people pick it up, Cang is right. It's hold it with two hands and start chopping away.
It's natural.
Yeah. Very, very hard. And you know, it's very hard not to do that with a lightsaber. You know, I mean, they don't let you handle them at Galaxy's Edge, I think, for that very reason. Like, you can't put a blade in them and all that stuff. They'll hold it out for you, but that's it.
I didn't know that, actually. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I get, it might depend on like how crowded it was, because when I was there, it was pretty, pretty packed. So
yeah, that makes sense.
they were just not like no, you can look at it and hold it here, but we'll let you do the blade later.
Like
So,
the music shop.
is it okay if I ask a question about the ASL FFE system?
Sure.
So, I'm honestly, I understand discussing Makashi in terms of the Lightspeed system. I created it from my own experience from Epe, and then, but it also it is dominantly expressed in Makashi form, I would say. But the rules for ASL FFE, as I understand them, are pretty different from ours. You've got very different rules from us. I believe you are required to chamber the weapon, right? And so I figured that would make your form very, very different, actually. And so I wonder, is Makashi, would you consider Makashi still to be the dominant way that ASL FFE expresses itself for the most part in competition, or is there more of a mix, or what would you say to that?
In competition, and Olivier might have more firsthand experience with this, but from what I've seen and encountered and stuff like that, there's a pretty good mix. Because there's also a lot of overlap with the French sport of stick fighting. So there are some people who are interested in that. So they're bringing what most people would consider kind of an Ataru, aspect to it. And it's not exactly you have to chamber it. It's just you have to bring the tip of the weapon behind you in some fashion, before you bring it forward to do your strike. And then once you do that, it's a priority system where they have to defend against that, right? So if I get my tip behind me before the other guy, they have to defend, and then it goes back and forth. So you can just take it like in a circle around, so you can take it directly to the other side, just as long as the tip kind of travels behind you. And then when you start out, you have to take the whole weapon behind you. So yeah, I mean, I can see where, yes, that doesn't seem very Makashi-like, because you want to be, all that stuff. So yeah, the rules, you have to, I teach it more in the way of trying to bring in that concept of facing off another person within a three-dimensional space. So it's not just back and forth, but you're constantly, you're going around like that. And then the blade and defensive actions, getting those kind of into your body, right? As far as the sport goes, that's probably where our Makashi training is going to benefit that the most, right? But that's a good point, because depending on the rule set, training can be tweaked to favor specific games and all of that kind of thing. But
and I think in a sense, the rule set that Cedric came up with was kind of tweaked to favor the expression of an art that did look like a Taru.
Right.
Right.
Something from the movies.
Yeah, Taru from the movies. That the ASL rule set kind of has the Dao in mind rather than the Gen, or rather than a thrusting sword.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Olivier chimes in saying, 35 years of advancing the point, and then suddenly there's a rule set that involves bringing the point back. This was an awful lot to to deal with.
Well, the nice thing about it is in our system, we have stuff that will kind of naturally go behind you in these things too. So like Ben's mentioned, we have the Dao, the single-edged saber, which has a lot of these same things there, but also includes, a little bit more body, that kind of thing.
Olivier also put in the chat that the advantage or the compensation for having to pull your point back is that you are allowed to do all this body rotation. Like the body usage is a lot more developed. So you can kind of compensate for this needing to retract with all the other movement.
Yes, yeah.
Right. The body advance.
Right, yeah.
I think the thing that we really kind of lose from Makashi, when we look at it in, rather than kind of a theoretical sense or a historical sense, when we look at it in a sporting sense, and I think that this is increasingly true across the lightsaber systems, is the notion of the thrust. And, training people for the mechanics of a good thrust, training thrust defenses. With my students, I spend a comparatively, not a huge amount compared to sport fencers, but, compared to, other sorts of, fencing-based martial artists, we spend a lot of time on thrusting and actually just targeting exercises, targeting drills. And we spend a lot of time on thrust defense. And I get questions from students, well, we can't use this in competition. So why should I learn this? And it's because you don't want to get stabbed, right?
Right.
But really, is that it? Because, the chance of any of us getting stabbed with a lightsaber in a dark alley is nil. But somehow I feel like that is the critical martial skill. That's part of the logic of the system that you do have to learn. And now suddenly I am finding myself having to justify to students, no, we are going to practice, tip control, and we're going to practice thrusting, even though we can't do it, in competition.
Well, I'll say this from a biomechanical standpoint. The thrusting action that you do with your body, you don't have to lead with the point. You can make it those little taps, right? So I always say to people, you want to learn how to thrust because it's a basic human thing. You want to be able to push. You need to be able to push force straight forward, right? That doesn't, does anybody have a problem not pushing when they don't want to? Do you ever find yourself, why am I pushing this? Oh no, right? So it's something that you can eat. I have not found, I have a very cut heavy curriculum. So I've got lots of cutting in it, right? So I've never found a deficit or never found, a deficit in stuff to do, eliminating the thrust.
Yeah.
But then again, like I said, I'm coming from a background that has a lot of cutting in it. So that's the limitation of my experience there. So, I can imagine coming from a sport like epee, where that's the thing, and then that can be a very, very difficult thing, especially when you train it at the competitive level, because you're training it at such a high degree. I think is the real drawback to changing, because it gets really into you. All right. Well, it looks like we are here at the end of our time. I'm gonna quickly check to see if we got any questions. We do have one here, little question, which I think we can all answer real quick, which is, what is the purpose of dueling? To hone one's skill, fun, intellectual stimulation?
Good question, Becky.
Yes. My answer is yes. It all depends on what's going on. A lot of, so
I think yes is a good answer to add on to that. The same reason that you play basketball with your friends, or the same reason that you go-karting. It's so that you have an event or an experience or an exchange with each other that you can then discuss on that intellectual level you mentioned.
Yep.
I think it's critical, Becky, in that you are always going to find people who are much, much better than yourself. And that's the real key to improving at any martial art, is there's got to be a balance between I can do this and, oh my God, it's too much, I can't do this, right? You're looking for this very fine line where you're comfortable enough to keep going, but it's not ever too easy. And that's where you learn, and that's where you advance. And that's what, you know, fighting and sparring and dueling allows us to do, is to kind of progressively move through opponents where we can kind of keep ourselves in that zone where we're going to be learning as much as we can, as fast as we can, you know, and it keeps things from getting stale.
Yeah. Good point.
I think the purpose of dueling is to answer the age-old question of life, which is who is the learner and who is the master. So.
Olivier, si tu veux que je répète la question ou
Oui, j'ai pas tout. C'était l'intérêt du duel, c'est ça?
Oui, c'est ça.
Quel est l'intérêt de s'affronter à quelqu'un?
Oui, et puis il avait des
Dans la
exemples.
règle.
Est-ce que c'est pour se perfectionner? Est-ce que c'est pour le développement intellectuel? Est-ce que c'est pour s'amuser?
Pour le jeu.
Pour le jeu, voilà. Toi, tu dirais pour le jeu?
Pour le jeu.
He says it's for the play.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, really, when it comes down to it, I think, I mean, I know of the people I know here, I'm assuming, Cang, you are in our group. We just love, you know, doing it. We love getting in there. We love sparring. We love fighting. We love bouncing, whatever you want to call it. You know, it's just, you know, it's almost a compulsion, to the point where, you know, obviously I'm taking Star Wars and I'm finding ways. Can I continue to do this and still, you know? So I think there we go. Anyway, so I think that's a good place to end. I want to thank the panel here. Great panel. Thank you, Cang, for joining us here. Hopefully we'll have you on sometime soon again.
Thank you, guys.
Merci, Olivier.
Merci à vous.
Yeah. And Daniel, Ben, Deso, good to see you guys again. Thank you all out there in Saberland. We will see you on next week. We will be talking about Form 3, Soresu, or the spinning form. Woo! So we're going to do lots of spinning and twirling and all kinds of stuff like that. And we'll see what happens there. All right. So from everybody here at TPLA, thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to the panel. Patience, practice, perseverance. Happy sabering.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.